Hello, and welcome to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam, and for today's case, we're going to be traveling to one of my favorite places. We're going to England. Unfortunately, this case is incredibly sad, incredibly scary. And we'll be discussing the murder of Sarah Everard. But before I get into Sarah's case, I really want to take a moment just to say thank you for the warm welcome back after taking a couple of months off. I was worried that I'd come back and it would be my mom and my sister being the only two people who are listening, but you all seem to have jumped right back into the show, and it's as if I was releasing episodes as normal. Thank you so much for that. It's so encouraging, and it makes me even more excited for the stuff that I have brewing in the background right now, and I can't wait to share it with you. But since I can't quite share any of that yet, let's go ahead and just dive straight into Sarah's case today. Sarah Everard was 33 years old at the time of her murder in 2021. She was born on June 14th, 1987, and grew up in York, England. She was the youngest of three children, and she was described by friends and family as being a little bit of an introvert, but still the type of person who was warm and welcoming, and people felt very lucky to be able to be friends with her. They all said that she was an amazing listener and that when you were able to enter that friendship with her, it was something that you cherished. And Sarah graduated from St. Cuthbert's Society, which is part of Durham University. And after graduating, Sarah quickly went into the workforce and began working in the world of marketing. Sarah had moved to London for her career, and shortly before her murder, she was hired by a digital marketing agency as a senior account manager. And she was living in Brixton, which is in South London. And her ultimate goals that she was working towards was to buy a house and start a family with her boyfriend. And in many of the articles that I read about Sarah, she was described as one of us, as a peer, as somebody who we as readers could really see ourselves being friends with. And I very much get that sense. Um, but I do kind of want to point out something I found incredibly frustrating, which is in zero relation to Sarah herself. This is more in relation to the reporting that I read. And I've brought this up in quite a few different episodes before, but I feel like what I get from most of these articles is very much a surface level description as a peer, a good friend, but I still really don't know a whole lot about Sarah. And we'll get into this a little bit later in the episode, but we know a whole lot about the man who murdered Sarah than we do about her herself. And I'm going to go into some things, but there's going to be a lot that I'm just not going to include about him because it's just not relevant. I don't want to go into who he is as a person when I can't do that for Sarah. Um and I did see a handful of articles that had really heartfelt quotes from Sarah's friends and family, and that was beautiful to read. But I felt like I really had to dig for it, and it was one of the last articles that I found. And so I just kind of want to bring this up because this is something that I have seen numerous times over the years of doing the show. And I find it upsetting. I want to be able to learn about these people that, especially in like Sarah's case, her murder stands for something. And I want to be able to understand who she is because from the little bit that I know, despite this truly horrific situation, I would hope that's something that her family and friends could be proud of. What this has turned into and what the impact that she was able to make in this terrible tragedy. Um, so I just kind of wanted to point that out, some personal thoughts. Let me know if you guys kind of feel the same way. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on it as well. But with all that being said, let's go ahead and dive into the events of the crime. On the evening of March 3rd, 2021, Sarah was visiting a friend in Clapham. And Clapham is the neighborhood next to Brixton in London. So it wasn't terribly far to go for her to go visit this friend. And this was during one of the lockdowns that London had to try to control COVID-19. In January of 2021, the British Prime Minister announced that the UK would enter its third lockdown. And this would include kids not being able to go to school and having to do school from home, travelers needing to quarantine upon arrival to the country. Um, and then by the end of February, public discussions had begun finally saying maybe the lockdown should be lifted, but that would end up being essentially a handful of days after Sarah's murder that it would be lifted. And there's actually an impact of that all in this case. That's kind of a big portion of what happened. So at this time, during this lockdown, UK was back to having limited group gatherings, masks were required again, and regulations were in place. And this was supported by law enforcement. Breaking these regulations could result in a fine. If you were caught having a large gathering, such as a rave, it'd be a £10,000 fine. A large group of 15 or more people is an £800 fine. A smaller gathering, less than 15 people, is a £200 fine. And for not wearing a face mask that in a required public setting, that is also a £200 fine. So they were taking this very seriously. Law enforcement was involved, and they were really trying to discourage public contact. And there was definitely a risk to breaking that protocol and those laws. And when Sarah went to go visit her friend in Clapham, it doesn't appear that she broke any COVID protocols. I didn't see reports that this was a large or even a medium-sized gathering with her friends at her friend's place. So it seemed like she was just kind of doing the COVID circle, I think is what we all called it, where it's like you have a handful of people you're willing to see, you stay within your small little circle, but you do allow yourself to have some social time instead of just sitting alone, home alone constantly. And around 9 p.m. that night, Sarah would leave her friend's apartment and walk home. And even though Clapham and Brixton were neighborhoods that were right next to each other, Sarah's walk home was about 4 kilometers or about 2.5 miles. And it would take her about 50 minutes to get home. And within just a handful of minutes, maybe about 10 minutes after leaving her friend's apartment, Sarah would call her boyfriend and spend about 15 minutes talking to him on the phone. Their call would end just after 9:15 p.m. And during this call, Sarah is walking through Clapham Common, which is a park right near where her friend lived. And she crossed through the park, made it through, and about 9:30 she would be seen on somebody's doorbell camera at A205 Ponders Road. And she's just seen walking down the street. She's wearing a green coat and what looks like blue checkered, or I've seen some say diamond print pants and green shoes, white or tan knit hat, and a COVID face mask. And there's a couple different CCTV cameras that would spot Sarah as she continued to walk down Ponders Road. And as she continued further down, Sarah would be seen on a bus's CCTV footage that showed her talking to a man standing in front of a white car with its hazard lights flashing. This man would end up showing Sarah his warrant or badge and arrest Sarah for violating COVID protocols. And I'm not sure what was said to Sarah. And as I mentioned, I don't believe she actually violated any COVID protocols, but he handcuffed her, placed her in the back of his car, and drove off. This CCTV footage from the bus is the last video of Sarah and the last time that she would be seen alive. The next day, Sarah's boyfriend began to worry when he didn't receive the confirmation that she had made it home safe the night before, and he hadn't heard from her that following day. And additionally, Sarah's friends had also become concerned for similar reasons. Minimally, the friend who had invited Sarah over the night before had expected a got home safe text. And this is just a side note for basically anyone. If it's not something that you and your friends or family typically do, please start doing that. It's just a get home safe text. It's something so simple and it can really make an impact when bad things happen. I have a friend, Lauren, who you've heard on the show during our episode on ghost ships in Canada. She always insists that when I get home, she receives a photo or video of my cat. Um, Usually it's my cat mad at me for the fact I wasn't home. Um, but that is kind of something fun that we do every time we see each other, just to make sure that we're being safe and being careful and keeping an eye on each other in case anything happens. But in Sarah's case, her not sending those message immediately sent off red flags. But also, Sarah is a 33-year-old woman. So her boyfriend didn't immediately go running to the police that following morning. He waited a little bit to see if maybe she forgot, maybe her phone died, something, just kind of trying to come up with an excuse of what could have happened that would result in her being fine. So he waited until 5 p.m. to report her missing. And unfortunately, even if he had reported her missing first thing in the morning, he unfortunately would have still been too late to help Sarah. So her boyfriend does report her missing on the evening of March 4th. And on the morning of March 5th, authorities escalate the case to the Specialist Crime Unit and they begin their investigation. And just for some potential clarification for those of us who are not in the UK, Scotland Yard is the home of London's Metropolitan Police, and the London police are often referred to as Scotland Yard or the Met. So if you hear me using those terms interchangeably throughout the rest of the episode, that I'm really referring to the same thing. I'll try to keep it consistent, but throughout the articles, it was referred to as both or one or the other. So just to take note on that. But on March 6th, the Met had asked the public for help. They let them know that Sarah had left a friend's home at 9 p.m. and was walking through Clapham Common shortly after, and they released some of the CCTV footage that they had gathered from her walk through the common, and then continuing down Ponders Road. And the next day, the footage was released of Sarah walking by someone's home at A205 Ponders Road. And this is when they began door to door inquiries to attempt to track down her route as she continued down the road and ask if anyone had seen her and go door to door. 4 days after Sarah was reported missing, the Specialist Crime Unit brought in additional investigators to work on her case. And Scotland Yard said that they remained optimistic that Sarah would be found alive. They received about 120 calls with tips and they encouraged anyone with CCTV footage of Sarah to send it in as soon as possible. On March 9th, scent dogs were brought into the area and a pond in Clapham Common was searched, and an area around many homes along Ponders Road were blocked off for forensic searches of their gardens. By this time, the investigators had CCTV footage from the buses that passed Sarah while she was talking to the man in front of the white car with its hazards on. And they traced the license plate back to the rental car company, which was out of Dover, which is a little bit south of London. And records indicate that a man named Wayne Couzens had rented the vehicle and that he had returned it in the early hours of March 4th, which led police to begin to investigate Couzens. Then, late on March 9th, nearing midnight, it was announced that there was an arrest made in connection to Sarah's disappearance. And at this point, it doesn't appear that the suspect's name had been released, but the public was told at this point that the man was an officer with the Met and had been arrested in his home in Deal, and a woman at the same location had also been taken into custody. And at this point, Sarah had not been found. And during a press conference the following morning, Scotland Yard said that they weren't ready to announce the name of the suspect or how long he had served as an officer. So Scotland Yard immediately got to work on the investigation in the man's home in Deal, along with some of the property that he owned near Ashford. And in this area in Deal and Ashford, this is in Kent. So this is a bit further out of London. I believe Deal is on the eastern coast of England, while Ashford's a little more inland. Um, so he wasn't quite in London, but it doesn't seem like it was a terribly far drive between these areas and where she potentially disappeared along Ponders Road. And neighbors would come out and talk to the media saying that a man who was an officer had lived at this house in Deal that was being searched. And he was there with his wife and his two children. And they very much seemed like a normal family. And a few hours later, Scotland Yard would host a second press conference in regards to the arrest. They announced that the man arrested was Wayne Couzens. He was 48 years old, and he was arrested on suspicions of kidnapping, rape, and murder. And there was a third press conference that day that announced that a body had been found in a wooded area near Ashford on Couzens' property. So let's dive into Couzens. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of information about him online. It's a lot easier to learn about him than it is about Sarah. I'm going to keep it fairly brief and to the point, because I honestly, I just don't want to give this man the time of day. But there is a lot to talk about. Over his career, Couzens had worked in 3 different police forces. In 2006, he began with the Kent Special Constabulary, which is a volunteer force that helps support the local police force. And then in 2008, he wanted to become a full-time officer. And during the vetting process, he failed due to the large amount of debt that he had. And due to this failure within the vetting process, it's my understanding that he shouldn't have been allowed to even continue as constable, but he wasn't relieved of his powers, even though it was still volunteer. Instead, 2 years later, he tried again. And this time, he was applying to be an armed officer with the Civil Nuclear Constabulary, which protects civil nuclear sites and nuclear materials, which I don't know exactly what that means, but it sounds quite intense. And and for those who, again, who don't live in the UK, who might not be aware of this, most officers in the UK don't carry firearms. In 2021, only 5% of officers carried firearms in England and Wales, and there were over 138,000 officers between the two countries, and only 6,478 of those officers carried a firearm. So it's a pretty big deal to be one of those officers. And in 2010, Couzens was applying to be one of those very limited positions that could carry a firearm. And the recommendation following Couzens' review was that they should not proceed with this promotion or this hiring. And This recommendation was unfortunately ignored, and he was hired anyway. Then in 2018, Cousins would apply for the Metropolitan Police. This time, he did pass the vetting process, even though he shouldn't have, because in 2015, he was reported for having exposed himself while in a car. The information about this indecent exposure was logged into the Met system, but it was not investigated or followed up on. And 3 years later, he would join the force as a Met police officer. And in February of 2020, Cousins was transferred to the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command, where Cousins was still permitted to carry a firearm and most frequently worked to patrol embassies in London. And this sector of law enforcement sounds like it's very high level. It protects Westminster Estate, Buckingham Palace, and Downing Street. And in November of 2020, he would be reported again for indecent exposure. So he is this, what seemingly is a pretty high ranking police officer. Within a year of being hired into that position, has another infraction of indecent exposure while somebody on a bike saw him masturbating in public. But similar to before, this wasn't really investigated before it was just closed. So even though this is technically an infraction, no one really knows about it because no one actually took the time to look into it. And then 1 year later, he would be caught for a third time. And this is while at a McDonald's drive-thru, he would expose himself twice to two different female employees, and he would then just pay for his food with his credit card and drive off, and not doing anything to prevent his identity from being found out. His name's right on his credit card. He's in his own car, his license plates. And the McDonald's employees reported these incidents, and this was just days before Sarah's murder. Again, this was barely investigated before the case was just kind of shoved off to the side and ignored. And it would later become known that there are 5 other potential instances that were not reported to the police of Cousins exposing himself in public to strangers. So I think it's pretty safe to say that Cousins has numerous offenses just fell through the cracks of the law enforcement system. And basically, immediately upon the release of this information, UK citizens were outraged. They got loud, they were criticizing the system, and they were questioning their law enforcement officers and if they were criminals themselves. And it also sparks a conversation of whether Scotland Yard were protecting their own, who were clearly violating laws that they were supposed to be enforcing. So the Metropolitan Police actually had to make a public statement about all of this, which we'll get to at the end of the episode. It kind of will help tie things in. But they received a lot of criticism, and I think it was quite fair based on this case and based on what we know about Cousins. He certainly fell through the cracks of the system and was allowed to continue to climb within the law enforcement system and have a lot of power when he shouldn't have. And there was an article in The Independent that also discussed some other potential crimes that Cousins may have committed. And this article noted that there is a report that when Cousins was in his early 20s, he had sexually assaulted a girl who was, quote, barely in her teens. And during the investigation, there were 4 other potential incidents of Cousins assaulting girls. The report also mentioned that there was a potential that Cousins was in possession of child pornography, with 3 more reports of potentially assaulting and raping women sometime between 2006 and 2007. and separate incidents of him potentially raping a man and a woman in 2019. Another thing I would like to note with all of this, because that was just kind of a lot of intense charges or potential accusations thrown at him. This is the only article I ever saw those specific accusations listed. So take it with a grain of salt, just because I only saw it in this one place. It's not that this isn't good reporting or truthful reporting. It's that I don't have the confirmation through other sources to say I believe this to its full, what it's saying word for word. Um, but it does seem to follow a potential pattern. But let's get back to Sarah's case. So Cousins was arrested on March 9th, 6 days after Sarah disappeared. And he was arrested after human remains were found on his land. His wife was also taken into custody on the belief that she potentially had helped her husband with the crime, but she was later released without charges, and authorities believe that she was in no way involved with his crimes. On March 12th, the body that was found on Cousins' property was identified as Sarah's. During his interrogation, Cousins told investigators a story about a Eastern European gang that had threatened him after he had underpaid for a sex worker a few weeks prior, and that this gang had demanded that they bring him another girl as payment. So, yeah, that he said that. And it's very quickly determined that this was just a very blatant lie, since Sarah's body had been found on his land. And Cousins had pretty quickly admitted that, like, yeah, that was a lie, and started to tell the truth. So between his interrogation, along with the evidence that they were currently tracking down and finding, they started to really piece together what had happened to Sarah that night. It became quite clear quickly that Cousins had been out looking for his victim that night. And after he started to become honest about this interrogation, he very much confirmed this. The month before Sarah's murder, Cousins had actually purchased handcuff keys, and this was in order to commit the kidnapping. I don't know if he lost the handcuff keys for the handcuffs he had, but this has been clearly noted that this purchase was in direct relation to the crimes he was planning on committing. And then at the end of February, on the 28th, just 3 days before the murder, he had reserved a rental car that would be used that evening. And this is the one that was seen on the bus's CCTV footage. And remember, he's planning this all ahead of time. He used his real ID to rent the car, and that's how the police had tracked him down, through the license plate that they saw on the CCTV footage. So he's trying to cover his tracks, but he's covering his tracks, kind of. Um, but then just before 5 p.m. on March 3rd, the day that he would murder Sarah, Cousins picked up the rental car, and this was essentially where he had begun to search for a victim. And he had worked a full shift that day. He actually worked an overnight shift, starting on March 2nd at 7 p.m., getting off at 7 a.m. on March 3rd. And sounds like he potentially just spent the whole day tooling around to London. And then he told his family that he was working that night when he was actually out driving around in this rental car looking for a victim. And at 8 p.m., he would stop by a Tesco in Kensington to purchase hair ties. And it is believed that this purchase was also specifically used as a tool during the attack. Investigators didn't really seem to give specific information for exactly what they were used for. They just said to commit the rape, kidnapping, and murder of Sarah. And they believe this because Cousins was bald. And so him going in and buying just one pack of hair ties and nothing else sends up a red flag. An hour and a half after his Tesco stop, Cousins would stop Sarah along Ponders Road, and he would tell her that she was violating COVID protocols. He would use his real police badge, put his handcuffs on her, place her in the back of his rental car. And there were witnesses that had since come forward saying that they saw this happening, but they really didn't think anything of it because they thought what they were seeing was an ununiformed officer making an arrest. And Sarah wasn't fighting back. It sounds like she was very much complying with his demands, thinking that there was potentially something that she was either violating or that this was a misunderstanding, and just to go with it because fighting against it could cause her more issues. And he very much used his position of power to give her that impression, if that's the case. Um, and the kidnapping itself, stopping along Ponders Road, getting Sarah into the car, it took less than 5 minutes. So he very much used the persuasion of him being an officer to get her into the back of his car. And then Cousins would drive to Dover, south of London, which is where he would actually switch cars. He would go from his rental car to his normal everyday car. And this would be seen on CCTV at 11:43 p.m. And at this point, Sarah is still alive, and she is with him now in his car. And over the next hour or so, his cell phone would be used multiple times in the outskirts of Dover. And it is believed that at some point within that hour, Cousins had raped and killed Sarah using the strap of a seatbelt in his car to strangle her. Around 2:30 a.m., Cousins would stop at a gas station to pick up a couple bottles of water and a couple bottles of juice in Dover. He would then be spotted on CCTV again, returning to his rental car that he had left in Dover around 7:30 a.m. Around 8:15 a.m., he stopped at a Costa Coffee to get a hot chocolate and a tart before returning the rental car at 8:30 a.m. And when he returned the rental car, it had over 300 miles driven on it in the 15 or so hours that he had the car. And he would continue to drive around, and he would go to Sandwich in Kent, where he disposed of Sarah's cell phone. It is believed that once he took it from her, he removed the SIM card so that there was no way that it could be used or tracked. And then at 11:05 a.m., he would be seen at a gas station filling up a jerry can. And about an hour and a half later, he would be seen on or near his property in Ashford, where witnesses would also notice a fire. So it was believed the gas that he put in that jerry can was used as an accelerant in this fire, which is where he was attempting to burn and dispose of Sarah's body. The next day, he would be seen buying garbage bags, where he then would return to the area where he had burned Sarah's body, and he would try to continue to dispose of her by putting her into the bags and trying to hide her even more. But ultimately, he would leave her on his property in Ashford. And after that time, things just went on as if nothing happened for Cousins. He did basic errands for the next couple days, such as just making appointments for his dog to go to the vet because he believed his dog was dealing with anxiety and separation from his owner. But he would actually end up calling in sick to work, claiming that he essentially needed a mental health day. And then within a day or two of that, he followed up with his supervisors saying that he no longer wanted to carry a gun. I don't know why he did this. It is mentioned in most articles, but it's not really elaborated on. But I do find that fairly interesting, that he would make that choice. But At the same time, I'm not sure if it's actually anything relevant, but it is worth noting, I feel like. And then on March 9th, he would be arrested for not only the kidnapping, rape, and murder of Sarah, but also for indecent exposure charges. Because while the investigation into Sarah's murder was happening, there ended up being a simultaneous investigation for what was happening with the incident at McDonald's in the drive-through. Because now that his name is being recognized, they realized that just a matter of days before Sarah's murder, he had the reports of the indecent exposure. And so there's simultaneous investigations going on. So at the time, he was also arrested for the indecent exposure. And one interesting piece of this investigation is that Cousins apparently had wiped the history of his cell phone only about 40 minutes before his arrest. And this led to a ton of speculation that someone within the Met or someone within Scotland Yard would have warned Cousins about this upcoming arrest. And according to a follow up from an internal investigation done by the Met, there was no breach of information to warn Cousins ahead of time of his arrest. And according to their statement, the arrest was done very quickly after the search of the land, and very few officers were informed of the arrest beforehand. But I fully understand that speculation coming from the public. They're already outraged over this case and coming down hard on the Metropolitan Police because of all of the indecent exposure complaints that had come forward. People who had come forward who had been victims of him exposing himself, and so people are angry, and I get it. One of their own, and really not just one of their own, one of their own who had special privileges and special rankings to carry a firearm when only 5% of officers could, had used his authority and power to falsely arrest a woman in a sensitive time during COVID protocols. And then he used that power to rape and murder her. And one thing I forgot to mention a little earlier was 2 days before Cousins' arrest, his wife and his two kids and him all went up to the woods on a family trip where he had disposed of Sarah's body. Now, I don't think his family knew anything whatsoever about his crimes, at least his crimes in relation to Sarah, but he took them up there to where he had disposed of her body a couple days previously. And so, yeah, people are outraged. I fully understand why. And they were having vigils to show their love and respect for Sarah and raising awareness at the failures of the system that allowed Cousins to continue to be an armed officer. And unfortunately, during some of these vigils, multiple people were arrested for violating COVID protocols, which I get it, but it also just kind of feels like a slap in the face given the situation. Um, and shortly after her murder, COVID protocols were lifted, but that's just it's terrible. And on July 9th, Cousins would plead guilty to the charges of kidnapping, rape, and murder of Sarah Everard. According to his lawyer, Cousins wanted to take responsibility for his crimes and his actions, and this will be something that he needs to live with for the rest of his life, which, in my personal opinion, is one of the worst things that he could say. It would be much better for him just to plead guilty with no comment. We know his criminal history and the numerous accusations against him. And given all of those accusations, and if there were thorough investigations done, it should have never have come to him murdering Sarah. And while he may feel guilt for his actions, acknowledging that he would have to live with that for the rest of his life after he took her life feels like an insult to everyone who knew Sarah and to everyone else who was also just touched by her case and felt impacted by her murder and the actions of Cousins. Um, that's just my 2 cents, but that's one of the most infuriating things to hear from somebody in Cousins' position. And in September of 2021, Cousins was sentenced for his crimes. The judge took into account that Cousins used his role as a police officer to take advantage of Sarah to commit his crimes, and he handed down a whole life order prison sentence, which means that he will spend the rest of his life in prison. There is no specific number of years tied to this sentence. It literally means he will be in prison until the day he dies, with no exceptions. Well, there's very, very minimal exceptions, but I doubt they will become a factor in this case. And to top it all off, in 2023, Cousins was sentenced for his indecent exposure incidents on top of his whole life order. And he was sentenced to 19 months for the indecent exposure. And as I mentioned earlier, the Met were strongly being criticized for their lapses in judgment when Cousins was vetted and not properly investigating the multiple claims of indecent exposure. So they ended up releasing a statement where they gave a list of things that they were going to do to improve their response to reports against officers and how they can better protect women against predators like Cousins. They said that they were essentially bringing somebody in to work PR, it sounds like. They want to evaluate the current Met culture and help rebuild the public image. And they're going to try to provide updates against crimes against women so that they can better support them to prevent them. And they plan to hire 650 new officers to be stationed in these crime hotspots. And they were going to develop a predatory offenders unit to look into these sorts of crimes. They are committed to investigating allegations against officers in a detailed and timely manner, which clearly wasn't done in Cousins' case. And they are going to improve their vetting process. And they're going to go back and review prior allegations against officers to ensure a thorough investigation. Now, I have no idea if they did any of this successfully. So I would be very curious if any of you are living in London and have noticed any of this, have heard about this case and kept an eye on it and the response from the police, especially if you're a woman. I would really love to hear your thoughts. So yeah, please reach out to me. You can find me on Instagram or you can email me at haveyouheardaboutThisCase@gmail.com. I'd be very, very curious to hear your thoughts. Um, and while preparing for this case, I listened to another podcast called I Could Murder a Podcast, and they covered Sarah's case. And I really liked their coverage. I hadn't heard of their show before. I'm definitely a fan now. I've been listening to them quite a bit in the last week or so since doing this research. But the podcast is hosted by a couple of men from the UK, and their research and delivery of the information is very good. It's very thorough. You can tell that they put a lot of time into it, which I really appreciate. But specifically, I really appreciate the conversation that they had near the end of the episode about the fear as a woman walking home alone at night. And it shouldn't be refreshing to hear. It should be expected. But it was refreshing to hear their thoughts on that fear that women face while they're walking alone at night and how tragic and really unacceptable it is. Um, as women, we shouldn't have to constantly have our head on a swivel. We should be able to walk home without incident and without the constant fear of incident and the fear of someone trying to take advantage of us and the fact that we're alone. And this isn't just about women, it's about everyone, but statistically, women are more likely to be victims of violent crime in these sorts of situations. And I can tell you just from my personal experience, while I've never been the victim of anything like this, nothing close, luckily. Again, I shouldn't have to say luckily, but I try to be very careful. I think about times where I'm like, I need to go to the grocery store. Let's try to walk to the grocery store before it gets dark. Let's try to do things like that in my day and plan my day around that sort of thing, even though I'm walking 2 to 3 blocks to pick up one bag of groceries. I that's a concern. That's definitely a concern. So it is nice to hear men talk about how this is not acceptable for women to feel like this and feel the need to always be on the defensive. And it was refreshing to hear that from them, and it's sad that it was refreshing, but I really appreciate it, and I give them kudos and in that conversation, because the more acceptable it is to say this is not acceptable, I think is better, to help prevent and hopefully reduce crime and to teach people that this is not okay. So I'll link their episode in the show notes. Their episode on Sarah was fantastic. As I said, I've been listening to them quite a bit in the last week or so since I listened to their coverage of Sarah's case, and I'm really enjoying their show. So I definitely recommend it. As I said, I'll link it below for you. Um, but that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And I would really appreciate it if you can leave me a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify, where you can follow our shows. You can find us on any major podcast platform, and on YouTube. You can also find us on Instagram at Have You Heard About This Case Pod and on TikTok at HYHATC. Or you can also email me at Have You Heard About This Case at gmail.com. I would really love to hear from those of you in London who may have observed any of these changes within the police force. I'd be very, very curious to know your thoughts. So I hope to hear from you all soon, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.